Hello, welcome to the first vlog/podcast, so let's call it vlodcast style version of the Imaginary Song Hunt, a monthly gathering of creative modern minds to reanimate lost songs from the deep past. Today's song hunt is all about beer, an excuse to drink it if you like, and an inebriated flight of fancy into ancient history and folklore, which is all set in motion by John Barleycorn, a classic British folk song in which a personification of barley is subjected to all manner of cruelties in the beer making process, but gets the last laugh when everyone ends up either too pissed to function or simply unable to function without him. I think it's fair to say that humans have loved beer since time immemorial. Brewing, fermentation, and intoxication are fundamental aspects of human history across all cultures. So before we begin, I think it behooves us to solemnly acknowledge that the drinking of beer is a sacred practice of great antiquity and must therefore be treated with reverence. So I'd like to commence this session with a prayer.
This here's the wattle, the emblem of our land. You can stick it in a bottle, you can hold it in your hand. Amen.
Beer is one of the few things that unites pretty much every human society. I think no matter where you're from in the world, your people will drink some kind of beer, whether it's made of barley, wheat, rye, corn, rice, or whatever. In that respect, it's a bit like Coke, which to my absolute horror shows up in the most remote places in the world where intrepid multinationals will bravely venture to profit from bad health. But I think beer is way healthier than Coca-Cola, if you ask me, so pour yourself a pint, let's commune with our ancient ancestors, break down some cultural barriers, and seek a spiritual awakening by getting pissed and singing about it. Since I am, as you're probably aware by now, a slave to the romance of the remote, I always like to dig down into ancient history to provide context for any topic, however tenuous the links might be. So we're going to start this session with a look at the oldest instances of ritualized and musicalized beer consumption, beer production, and beer veneration. It's pretty well known by now that the Sumerians were big beer drinkers, so I think that we can say with certainty that for as long as there are written records of human culture, there are written records of beer. But the history of beer must go back way further than that. And the origins of beer are perhaps easier to imagine than the origins of drinking dairy products, for example. You've probably heard that classic comic rhetorical question about who the first person to milk a cow was and what the hell they thought they were doing at the time. Well, the first time that boozy fermentation occurred, it was probably just a result of some mashed cereals sitting out a little bit too long in the sun. Yeah, I can just imagine the journey from horror at having to consume something that had gone off because it was all that was left, to the highly unexpected pleasure of a subtly altered state of consciousness. By the time it was being written about, the process was already very well honed. The Sumerians were so into their brew that they even incorporated detailed recipes into some hymns. The most famous example is a hymn to the booze goddess Ninkasi, which was pressed into clay tablets around about 1800 BCE, which has inspired quite a substantial community of food archaeologists and hipster breweries to recreate the recipe for the modern drinker. Here's a translation of part of the hymn from the Oxford Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature. Ninkasi, it is you who handle the dough with a big shovel, mixing in a pit the beer bread with sweet aromatics. Ninkasi, it is you who bake the beer bread in the big oven and put in order the piles of hulled grain. So it's news to me that bread was involved in beer making. The Sumerians called this beer bread bapir. Now, I've been getting to grips with the recipe by following in the footsteps of some of the intrepid culinary experimental archaeologists who have recreated it. I say following in their footsteps. I mean, I don't actually have the patience even to make bread, let alone sourdough, let alone multi-day homebrew. So what I actually did was read the recipe, imagine myself following it, and then drink a can of Stella. According to the blogger AnthroChef, the process starts with soaking wheat berries overnight, draining them, and then keeping them humid until they sprout, which takes a couple of days. During this time, you make the bapir with yeast, barley, and water. It proves for a few days, presumably in a pit with sweet aromatics. And then the hymn continues, Ninkasi, it is you who water the earth-covered malt. The noble dogs guard it, even from the potentates. I'm not sure how faithful to the recipe the food archaeologists have typically been in relation to this last section. It conjures an image in my mind of a noble dog, let's say an English pointer, defending a small microbrewery from a powerful git like Vladimir Putin or Boris Johnson. That actually gives me an excuse to launch into an anecdote about my one run-in with Boris, which was in Trafalgar Square in 2016. So the Gold Lyra team and I were singing Mesopotamian songs in Trafalgar Square as part of this grand unveiling of a 3D printed Palmyra arch, which was blown up by ISIS in 2015. So Boris did his infamous 2 fingers up to ISIS speech, and then we started our set of Mesopotamian songs with the Sumerian Gold Lyre of Ur. But Boris didn't like the music. Apparently it was getting in the way of his hobnobbing with journalists. So one of his aides just came along and unceremoniously turned off our amplification. Bloody Philistine. So we finished our set inaudibly, despite the expense and the logistics of getting us there. So you heard it here first. Boris Johnson is a menace to the reconstruction of ancient Sumerian music. Not his worst crime, but one that bothered me on that particular day in 2016. So it makes it really important then to have noble dogs on hand to keep him away, whether you're reconstructing ancient Mesopotamian music or ancient Sumerian beer. In fact, just in general, I think it's a good idea to keep him away, especially from countries. Incidentally, The Flood, which has been on a little break from digital streaming platforms, will be back online this Friday, the 6th of September. So if you fancy a little stream on that day, you'll basically be telling the algorithm that I'm cool. And more importantly, you'll be sticking 2 fingers up to Boris Johnson, the destroyer of Sumerian singing. Anyway, back to the hymn. The reconstructed recipe goes on to describe the mixing of malted grain with this bapir bread and some date syrup. The mixture is fermented, filtered, and drained. And the hymn concludes, Ninkasi, it is you who pour out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is like the onrush of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Once finished, according to AnthroChef, the beer tastes a lot like cider. It is, in his words, the kind of draught which helped build a civilization. So there you have it, beer making in hymn form. I typically like to make a sing-along version of these kinds of texts for these sessions, but I don't have one for the hymn to Ninkasi, sorry. But if you fancy another Sumerian beer recipe sing-along, then look no further than the Sumerian drinking song set by Lorna Govier in collaboration with Anne Kilmer, which you can find on YouTube with its catchy refrain, Kashe, 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 kash, kashe, kash, kashe, kash, which just means drink, 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 drink. A timeless message, I feel, uncluttered by literary pretensions.
Kashe, 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 kash, kashe, kash, kashe, kash, kashe, 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 kash, kashe, kashe, kash.
My favourite line from the song is translated by Anne Kilmer as, the fermenting vat makes the liver glad. And I think that Henry Purcell, composer of the round He That Drinks Is Immortal, would have appreciated that sentiment. From Bapir to Barleycorn. These kinds of devotional texts from the ancient world are typically labelled as hymns by paleographers and archaeologists, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were hymns in the sense that we understand the word today, as in a song sung in a worship context. Texts like this one may well have been sung or at least recited in ritual contexts, but they may equally well have just been pure literary texts, maybe even just written down so that scribes could practice their cuneiform. The connection, or the lack thereof, between writing that survives and the oral tradition that doesn't is one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. The formulaic style of writing, with its parallelism and direct line-by-line repetition in this hymn, is entirely typical of Sumerian poetry and shares lots of characteristics with sung traditions that are performed out loud and not generally written down. That doesn't prove anything, but I think for me it's good enough justification for me to present this as the earliest possible antecedent to our song John Barleycorn. My standards of proof are very low. But aren't these parallels fascinating? Here's an ancient Sumerian song in which beer is personified in divine form in this case, and the process of beer making is described in some detail, just like John Barleycorn. So I'm just going to go ahead and claim that John Barleycorn dates all the way back to 1800 BCE. And I can say that if I want to, because this is the post-truth era. John Barleycorn. This wonderful song must be one of the most widely sung and wildly varying of all British folk songs. Even a cursory glance into the archives of the Ralph Vaughan Williams Memorial Library reveals a massive wealth of resources, which dwarfs the available documents for any of the other songs that I've investigated on this hunt so far. Famous versions that you might enjoy listening to, and as always I'll share a selection of links in the spoils of the hunt, include a gorgeous 2021 recording by Sam Lee, versions by Oyster Band, Pentangle, Fairport Convention, Maddie Pryor, Jethro Tull, John Renbourn, The Imagine Village, Martin Carthy, Steel Ice Band, The Watersons, it goes on and on and on, and of course A.L. Lloyd. That list barely scratches the surface, because everybody sings this song. Of course, the greatest version of all time is the one sung by the tenors and basses of Cambridge Timeline Choir in our recent concert. In all variants of the song, John Barleycorn personifies beer, usually the process of planting, harvesting and brewing the barley for beer, which is presented as a series of acts of violence against John Barleycorn. The most widely sung version nowadays seems to be the variant that was recorded by A.L. Lloyd, that's Albert Lancaster Lloyd, in 1961 on his Drinking Songs EP, All For Me Grog, or sort of variations on this general way of singing John Barleycorn. In the sleeve notes to the album, Lloyd claimed to have taken the song down during drinking sessions at a pub called the Eel's Foot on the southeast coast of England. He wrote, "To the Eel's Foot on a Saturday night, the farm workers bring their songs and match them against the songs of sailors and cattle dealers and travelling tinsmiths. Everything is formal. A chairman keeps good order with a cribbage maker for a gavel. No one sings unless called upon, but each gets his turn. Mostly the songs are of the Saturday night kind that the genteel would call bacchanalian. These are not drinking songs in the strict sense, not songs merely in praise of liquor. For in England, such songs usually are made by men of book learning who fancy themselves as rakes, and the folk will have none of them." I find this last comment particularly interesting, and I'm going to come back to it because it chimes with some of my own impressions of written transmissions of this song and lots of other folk songs. As is often the case with print publications like broadside ballads, some of these supposed songs of the people have a distinct whiff of a posh person at a writing desk feeling very pleased with themselves for a clever rhyme. They are, in a word, literary. As with most folk songs, and as must be especially true for a song that has been so widely sung for such a long time, on a theme at least as old as civilization itself, there are lots of contrasting versions. Everybody who transmits the song, be that out loud or in writing, makes adaptations, little or large, according to their own taste. And some of those people, at least to my ears, have very bad taste indeed. We'll take a dip into some of these variants at the end of the session, but first let's get a swig of A.L. Lloyd's very well-known version, and variations upon this have been recorded by the likes of Sam Lee and Martin Carthy. And I think, as we'll see, there are good reasons for the particular popularity of this variant.
There was 3 men come out of the west, their fortunes for to try. And these 3 men made a solemn vow John Barleycorn should die. They ploughed, they sowed, they harrowed him, and throwed clods upon his head. And these 3 men made a solemn vow John Barleycorn was dead. They let him lie for a very long time, till the rain from heaven did fall. And little Sir John sprung up his head, and that amazed them all. They let him stand till midsummer, and he growed both pale and wan. Then little Sir John, he growed a long beard, and so became a man. They hired men with the scythe so sharp to cut him off at the knee. And poor little Johnny Barleycorn they served most barbarously. They hired men with the sharp pitchforks to pierce him to the heart. And the loader he served him worse than that, for he bound him to the cart. They wheeled him all around the field, a prisoner to endure. And in the barn poor Barleycorn they laid him upon the floor. They hired men with the crabtree sticks to cut him skin from bone. And the miller he served him worse than that, for he ground him between two stones. I'll make a boy into a man into an ass. I'll change your gold to silver, lads, and your silver into brass. I'll make the huntsman hunt the fox with never a hound or horn. I'll bring the tinker into jail, says old John Barleycorn. Oh, barley wine is the choicest drink that was ever drunk on land. It'll make a man do miracles by the turning of his hand. You can tip your brandy in a glass, your whiskey in a can, but Barleycorn and his nut brown ale will prove the stronger man.
Some cool themes emerge in the words of this song, alongside the obvious agricultural and culinary ones. The personification of significant aspects of day-to-day life in literature and oral tradition. Allegory as a kind of safe space in which to explore extreme violence, ritualized symbolic killings on special occasions, and the idea that life's responsibilities aren't really manageable without booze. To quote the lyrics of the final verse as it's sung by Martin Carthy, "For the hunter he can hunt the fox, nor so loudly blow his horn. And the tinker he can't mend his kettles or his pots without a little bit of John Barleycorn." The idea that everything just goes to shit and everybody stops functioning without booze seems kind of innocuous and funny enough at first, but I just want to reflect on that for a second. If the tinker can't mend his pots, then the tinker can't get money, and he can't get booze without money, and he's dependent on the booze in order to mend his pots and get the money, so it's a circle. Whoever sets the price of and controls access to booze therefore has total control over the tinker. So in addition to monopolies on the distribution of intoxicating substances and enforced prohibition, an important way in which alcohol is deployed as a means of controlling working classes is the strategic fostering of addiction among subjugated populations. So think of opium and other drugs in China, courtesy of the Japanese and the Brits, and the genocide in Tasmania, which occurred as much through alcohol addiction and disease as direct physical violence. Similarly, the Nazis supposedly insisted on paying non-German workers in Poland in alcohol in order to undermine Polish society. Another example from relatively recent history that immediately springs to mind for me is described in the Guatemalan activist Rigoberta Menchu's autobiography, in which she narrates how US-backed farmers in Guatemala strategically got male members of their enslaved Mayan workers drunk every night in a kind of fiendish strategy that was designed to prevent them from organizing any kind of resistance, to keep them in poor health, I guess, and above all, to take their meager wages straight back off them as soon as they'd been distributed. I think there are probably countless examples of cross-human history of alcohol addiction as a means of controlling subject populations. Thinking back to the upper-class literary songs in praise of drink, sure, a lot of it is kind of harmless doggerel about feckless poshos showing off how debauched they are. Oh yeah, occasionally blooded, like, it was hilarious. Or the 19th century equivalent of that, which maybe sounds a bit like this poem from Bentley's Miscellany of 1842. Oh heavy wet, thine excellence, I sing, oh heavy wet, nectar of man, who having beer, need envy not Olympian cheer. On thee my soul is set. Is there an implication of subjugation of the working class in John Barleycorn's seemingly light-hearted narrative about tradespeople needing beer to function? To understand the song better, while indulging my theories about Barleycorn as a manifestation of the oppression of the working classes, I naturally delved into the deep history of its associated imagery and lore, and there are a lot of interesting questions to explore. So let's get back to ancient history for some non-answers, and probably lots and lots more questions. John Barleycorn's ancient ancestor, Beo. Fast forward from the Sumerians then, via the bacchanalian rituals of classical antiquity, the ancient Greek goddess of drink, Miti, and the Old Norse barley god Bugvir, and we arrive, in the not-so-dark ages, in Anglo-Saxon England, where most of the antiquarian speculation about origins for John Barleycorn begins. If we discount my Sumerian detour, then you'll find that I'm actually leading you down a very well-trodden path. The internet is awash with speculation about ancient pagan origins for this story of beer and bloody murder. I'm finding that the same pattern seems to emerge whenever I try to learn about a folk song online. Blog after blog, article after article, page after page will reproduce the same statement that the song may date back to such and such a time. But when you actually look at the source for these oft-repeated claims, you usually find that it's just a thing that one person once said with zero evidence to back it up. Much of the speculation about this song reproduced online and in liner notes seems to be traceable to Kathleen Herbert's Looking for the Lost Gods of England, which is a published transcript of a talk given to a meeting of Anglo-Saxonists in 1994, in which she claims that John Barleycorn is the modern equivalent of Beowa, or Beo, an ancient figure who was mentioned in 10th century genealogies and not really anywhere else. Kathleen Herbert was a Tolkien scholar and a fiction author who passed away in 2016. In Looking for the Lost Gods, which is reportedly her most popular publication, she draws some very juicy parallels between evidence from late antique and Anglo-Saxon writers and surviving, or at least more recently documented, English folk traditions. It's easy to see why the book is so popular and why this claim has been so influential, because her writing is compelling and enlivened by some very wide-ranging and fascinating research. Her narrative traces a lineage from neo-pagan harvest rituals back to the Roman writer Tacitus, whose ethnographic work Germania describes how ancient English peoples venerated the goddess Nerthus, who is a great earth mother. He describes a rather wonderful ritual involving a wagon and bovine divination, which is basically some cows deciding where the goddess wanted to be venerated by pulling a wagon until they got bored and stopped to chew the cud. The ritual concluded with the drowning of slaves in a lake, which was, FYI, necessary because the slaves were appointed to wash the goddess and lay folk could not touch her and live. For Kathleen Herbert, this description from the turn of the 2nd century CE provides context for the Old English ekerbot, or field remedy charm, which was written down in the 10th century, quite a long time later. Hopefully some of you will remember the incantation Erke, 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 Erdan Mordor from our previous song hunt. It's a lovely and rather rare example of an earth goddess invocation in medieval literature, which is of course mixed with Christian imagery. In the ritual, for Herbert, the Earth Mother is impregnated by the Christian divine force, with the plough as a kind of great holy phallus, which fills the earth with seed for the next harvest. What was going on, writes Herbert, was a mating of Mother Earth with the God of Heaven. And before the ritual was Christianized, she reasons, there must have been a pagan male god to impregnate the Earth Mother, who was then supplanted by the Christian god. Finding parallels between ancient texts, myths and legends isn't really that difficult, particularly as most ancient religions did tend to attach spiritual significance to the things that were necessary for survival, so harvest, fertility, and I guess maybe we can put booze in that category as well if we believe the final verses of John Barleycorn. What I'm getting at is that you can usually find parallels if you look for them. You can find them if you want to find them. Things seem excitingly similar, but it doesn't prove that they're related. So here's a parallel of mine. The symbolic burying of a loaf of bread inside the first furrow, which is something that's described in the Akerbot charm, the field remedy, makes me think of Ninkasi's buried bapia bread. So I'm going to use that parallel to continue to advance my claim that John Barleycorn is in fact Ninkasi, and the song dates back to 1800 BCE. And let's say also that Ninkasi is therefore the Erdan Mordor who's invoked in the field remedy charm. I don't mean to poo-poo Kathleen Herbert, by the way, by making this kind of silly comparison, because her book is great and it's highly entertaining. It's just that I wish that these claims, which are, fine in one context, didn't get reproduced quite so wantonly all over the internet. I think everyone's just looking for a fast, impactful thing to say. And I have to include myself in that. Agricultural anthropomorphism offers another striking parallel between John Barleycorn and countless ancient harvest rituals, like the Akerbot and Nerthus's wagon. But again, this doesn't really prove any direct links. Everything important seemed to have a divine personification at some point in the ancient world, including booze and barley. Kathleen Herbert's narrative of English harvest rituals situates John Barleycorn's genesis in royal genealogies of the House of Wessex, which were commissioned by King Alfred in the 10th century. Presumably to demonstrate the legitimacy of the dynasty, they trace Alfred's line back to a mythical king, Sheaf, or Sheaf, who was born on Noah's Ark, and his son, Shield, and his grandson, Beo, which means barley. Herbert confidently states that this ancient mythical Beo is the John Barleycorn of the folk song, which I suppose is a more reliable theory than my theory that Barleycorn is Ninkasi. She also finds a wonderful explanation for this intriguing sequence of names in a 10th century divination ritual from a monastery in Abingdon, which involved a sheaf of corn being placed in a shield and floated along the Thames in order to demonstrate the will of God and resolve a land dispute. This shield-riding divination sheaf is, for Herbert, a clear parallel for the veneration of the sheaf as a symbol for ancient harvest gods, like the Roman goddess Ceres and the Germanic Nerthus, traces of which are preserved in the Akerbot ritual and in later neo-pagan rituals like harvest queens and corn dollies. Whether or not the mythical Beo has anything to do with John Barleycorn, what we can at least infer from all of this is that the ancient English liked a good piss-up just as much as the Sumerians. We also know from Tacitus that they drank a liquor made of fermented barley, which the Roman Emperor Flavius Claudius Julianus later joked stank of billy goat. But I've still got a bee in my bonnet about this idea that people need beer to function, and Kathleen Herbert hasn't helped much with that. Although there is an interesting line about ale in Elfric's colloquy, which goes something like this. "Und what drinkst du?" which means, and what do you drink? And this is a teacher to a student, and the student replies, "Elu, jefich hebbe, other water, jefich nebbe elu." So that means ale if I have it, or water if I have no ale. If we take that literally, then at least this student in Elfric's colloquy, if no one else, was pretty alcohol dependent. Okay, so I task you to go forth and find examples in ancient literature of people not being able to do their jobs without beer. I bet there must be lots of them. As far as Old English antecedents for John Barleycorn go, I think we need look no further than the riddles, the Old English riddles, which, like the folk song, are anthropomorphic and funny. The riddle, usually solved as mead, each eum werth verum, progresses from describing ingredients in their natural state, presumably carried from flowers by bees, to a kind of recipe, to the effects. So it seems like a pretty close analogue to me for John Barleycorn. Here's a translation by Wendy Hennekeen. "I am worthy to men, found widely, brought from the woods and foothills, from dales and mountains. Wings carried me aloft by day, brought with skill under the roof's shelter. Afterwards, heroes bathed me in a bucket. Now I am binder, striker, and soon thrower of an old churl even to the earth. He who seizes me and against my might contends, soon finds that he must seek the earth with his back, if he doesn't leave off his folly beforehand. Stolen his strength, strong his speech, Deprived of might, he does not have the possession of mind, feet, or hands. Learn what I am called, who on earth so binds men, foolish or with folly after blows by day's light. Okay, this is alcohol made from honey, not barleycorn, but isn't it amazingly similar? And for those of you who are wondering, yes, plenty of people have made mead using Anglo-Saxon recipes. I could probably go on searching for these kinds of parallels forever, so let's draw a line under this riddle and fast forward to the written transmissions of John Barleycorn, which do have quite a lot in common with it. John Barleycorn's next ancient ancestor, Alan. John Barleycorn's written transmissions actually go back quite far, to the turn of the 16th century, which suggests that a version of the song must have been doing the rounds at least as early as the late 15th century, since these things were generally already quite well known by the time that they got written down. The oldest known written transmission is in the 16th century Bannatyne manuscript, which is an anthology of literature of the 15th and 16th centuries, and it includes Scottish court poetry and Middle English lyrics. The works were collated and copied down by the Scottish merchant George Bannatyne, actually as a lockdown project. No, really, he was stuck at home sitting out a plague in Edinburgh. It's an amazing document in multiple volumes with absolutely mountains of fascinating songs. Our song is known as Why Suld Nocht Alana Honoured Be, which means why shouldn't Alan be honoured? Well, I quite agree, Alan's a great guy, which is the one-line refrain that ends every verse. Historical linguists date the poem or song to around about 1500 because of its language. I'm going to share a couple of examples with sincere apologies for my pronunciation. 16th century Scots is obviously not my area of expertise. I don't really have any areas of expertise, but 16th century Scots is even less of an area of expertise than the usual areas that are not of expertise that I talk about. So I'm just going to guess how to read the poem by speaking kind of early modern English with a fake Scottish accent. So huge apologies to any 16th century Scots who are listening. When he was young and clad in grena, highs and his ire about his ene, both men and women did him mena. When he grew on yon hillis hay, why sold nocht Alana honoured be. In this verse we encounter Alan, proto-John Barleycorn if you like, as a young sheaf of barley growing in the field, clad in green, with his hair all around his eyes, admired by both men and women. The poem's quite long, so I won't read it in full, thank God, I can hear you thinking. But like John Barleycorn, it goes on to describe stages in the life cycle of beer, as personified by Alan. And towards the end of the poem, we're treated to some descriptions of his influence. It was there never sa gay a galana, fry mate with our meisters sheer alana. But if he held him by the halana, backward on the floor falls he. Why sold nocht alana honour it be? So in this verse, a galana, which presumably shares its root with gallant and refers to a young man, falls onto the floor, backward onto the floor falls he under the influence. So compare the Old English fate hrutje shel hruzan sekan, which means that he must find the floor with his back. That's a line from the Mead riddle. And later in the song, we consider Alan's impact upon the wallet. My meister Alana, I may sire curse, he levis no money in my purse. At his command I maun deburse, more nor the twa pert of my fee. Why sold nocht Alana honoured it be? Oh my God, that was impossible. But you get the idea. He's taking half of someone's fee and leaving no money in their purse. Alan has a better time in this poem than poor old John Barleycorn. The descriptions don't involve any of the deliberate violence and cruelty of the later song. Another Barleycorn theme that doesn't really come up in this early antecedent is the idea that working people can't work without him, but I'm intrigued by this reference to money, which brings back to mind the idea of controlling the working population through alcohol. Pay the workers, then get their fees straight back off them. I'm maybe clutching a little bit at straws here. A similar later Scots ballad about alcoholic Alan was printed by the antiquarian Robert Jameson in his Popular Ballads and Songs in 1806. It's known as Alan a Malt, which is Alan of the Malt, and seems to be about whiskey rather than beer. But in this obviously related version, we do find the cheery bloodlust of John Barleycorn, and its alliterative descriptions of violence are quite amazing. The threshing is especially gruesome. Mail for mail and baff for baff, till his hide flew about his lugs like chaff. So it's like mail for mail, stroke for stroke, and baff for baff, which is just, it's obvious biff, baff, boff. And that's his skin flying around his ears like chaff. Then Alan is burstled, which is scorched, upon the kiln until he's bane dry and ready for the mill or the hopper. They cooped him then into the hopper, as they tipped him, and broke his banes gnapper for gnopper. A pleasant ballad of bloody murder. The earliest printed source for English variants of the ballad is a broadside printed by Henry Gosson of London sometime between 1607 and 1641. It was evidently popular and was reprinted by other well-known ballad printers. Like the ballad itself, the title is rather copious. A pleasant ballad to sing evening and morn of the bloody murder of John Barleycorn. After 35 verses, yes, 35 verses, the last line of the reprint in the Folk Music Journal reads, "The end of the first part." So I am not going to try and read the whole thing, you'll be glad to know. But to summarise, some noblemen have a merry meeting in the North Country and get into a fight. And they are Thomas Goodale, Sir Richard Beer, William Whitewine, and of course John Barleycorn. They all fight in their associated drinking vessels, which I love the idea of. They're like, in my head, they're like little tanks coming at each other, like the bowl for the beer and a wine glass. And John Barleycorn wins this battle because he's the stronger man, and that sends the others into a rage, so they have a bit of a discussion about how to kill him before burying him alive and celebrating with a feast. When he rises again, having been buried, the next season they are sore amazed, at which point the tortures recounted in the versions that are still sung today commence with quite a bit of additional detail. Peter Wood, writing in the Folk Music Journal in 2004, speculates that the original John Barleycorn that today's versions descended from was likely inspired by this broadside ballad, which was itself inspired by some variant of Alan a Malt, the older Scots ballad. Robert Jameson suggested that the abridgment of this long ballad was probably casual rather than intentional, and owing more to default of memory than to superiority of genius. To me, this seems like a classic example of Enlightenment era genius cult thinking. I think Jameson sees the accident of remembering as something unskilled, and the improvement of the ballad through this abridgment, therefore, as a kind of happy accident. Peter Wood, on the other hand, speculates that the abridgment was a deliberate choice to make the song more palatable to a mid-18th century audience. With the usual caveat that we can never know for sure how these variations occur, I'm going to lay my own cards on the table and say that I love the idea of communal remembering as a kind of unconscious arbiter of quality, which ensures the survival of the most economical or impactful versions of songs. Time and time again, I think, nosing through the archives reveals fussy, literary, intellectualized variants of famous songs that are probably best forgotten, which I find a rather poetic illustration of the power of communal, democratic oral tradition to separate the wheat from the chaff, if you like, threshing off the long-winded and unnecessary details, while the memorable substance of stories like these survive. But I would say that because I'm a big red lefty. In between the very verbose broadside ballad and the huge proliferation of shorter transmissions from the 19th century onwards are other versions, the most famous of which is Robert Burns' John Barleycorn poem, which was first printed in 1785 in the Commonplace book. It was and is very widely known. Burns himself noted that this text was, quote, partly composed on the plan of an old song known by the same name. It's much closer to the A.L. Lloyd song we heard at the start, and the variants that are most widely sung today. If nothing more, it at least offers one written example of the economical, improved version of the song that somehow evolved from the waffly broadside. Maybe Burns himself was solely responsible for the tasteful pruning. Seems unlikely, though. In the publication, Burns himself noted, "I once heard the old song that goes by this name sung, and being very fond of it and remembering only 2 or 3 verses of it, is the first, second and third, with some scraps that I have interwoven here and there." Maybe, like Robert Burns, innumerable pub singers each remembered their own scraps, from which a collective, orally compiled scrapbook emerged. And that brings me at last to the variants of John Barleycorn that survived long enough to be noted down by the busy transcribers of the first British folk revival. And if you'd like to join me to have a listen to some of these and maybe sing one of them, then head over to Zoom now at the link that I've emailed you, and I will be waiting for you there.